Good morning. My name is Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar on the current crisis, immigration crisis in the U.S.-Mexico border, and what are the best solutions? I mean, what is what we can do to cope with this crisis? I'm very pleased to co-organize this with COMEXI, and the president of COMEXI, Dr. Sergio Alcocer, is here with us. He will introduce shortly our four panelists. We decided to add yesterday, and thank you, Cecilia Farfan, to talk about the current crisis in the border, what happened in Tamaulipas, and how that will affect U.S.-Mexico border. So let me let me welcome you all on behalf of El Universal and for Mexican and a series of Mexican newspapers. El Universal, El Debate, El Siglo de Coahuila, El Siglo de Durango, El Siglo de Torreón, El Informador, El Imparcial, Frontera, Crónica de Baja California, Pulso, y El Diario de Yucatán. Let me give you the floor so you could introduce our panelists. Go ahead, Sergio, please.
Thank you very much, Rafael, and good morning, everyone. And it is my distinct pleasure for me to introduce the panelists today. I want to start by introducing Teresa Cardinal Brown. She's the senior advisor of the Bipartisan Policy Center for Immigration and Border Policy. She's an expert on immigration and national security with an extensive professional background in the field. She was a member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and worked also in the American International Immigration Lawyers Association. She was policy advisor in the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Commissioner, and she also worked in the Department of Homeland Security for Secretary Michael Chertoff at one time, but also she was the director of the working group in the Office of Policy in the Department of Homeland Security, as I mentioned. She's a graduate from the University of Denver with a degree in international relations and economics, and she's seldom writes in different newspapers and outlets. So very welcome, Teresa. Very, very nice to have you here. I would also like to introduce Cecilia Farfan. She is right now she oversees the center, the U.S. Mexico Center at the University of California in San Diego, on research, policy engagement activities covering security, immigration, democracy, and Cali Baja. Cecilia is an expert on organized crime and female participation in criminal groups and co-founded the Mexico Violence Resource Project, that is an online platform providing analysis and resources for journalists and policymakers on this topic. She's participating also in ITAM, in the Center for Studies on Security, Intelligence, and Governance. Cecilia received her doctorate in political science from UC Santa Barbara, and his master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University, and her bachelor's in international relations from ITAM. So Cecilia, very nice to have you with us. Allard Brown Gort is a visiting professor for international relations at ITAM, a senior non-resident fellow at the University of California in San Diego in the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies. Allard has a master's in public administration from the University of Texas at Austin and a PhD in philosophy from Carlos III University in Madrid. Dr. Brown Gort's major interest includes immigration policy, political and economical implications, the role of culture and identity in shaping values, institutions, and political system. Allard was the executive director of the Casa de la Universidad de California in Mexico, and currently he serves on the advisory council of Sin Fronteras and also on different projects here at UNAM and in the editorial board of Foreign Affairs Latin America. So Allard, very nice to have you here. Thank you very much for being with us. And finally, I would like to introduce Ariel Ruiz Soto. He is a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. He is particularly in charge of developing work on U.S. immigration policy program and the Latin America and Caribbean initiative. She holds a master's degree from the University of Chicago, School of Social Service Administration. He examines the interaction of immigration policies in the region that stretches from Panama to Canada. And he also analyzes demographic trends across the region and methodological approaches to estimate the unauthorized immigrant population in the United States. He was part of the National Alliance for Latin America and Caribbean Communities as a youth coordinator. And now he works, as I said, in the Migration Policy Institute. So thank you very much to all of you to be with us. And then going back to you, Rafael.
Thank you, Sergio. Let me remind you, to all of you, that we want to have this as interactive as possible. So there's a Q&A button in your screen. So please use it, send the questions to the panelists, and they will be reading your questions. Sergio and I will feed them with your questions. So please just use the button and make this as interactive as possible. Teresa Brown, let me start with you. Teresa, I mean, it feels like there's a permanent crisis in the U.S.-Mexico border. Since Biden came into power, we have a lot of first Central Americans. Eventually, we have Ukrainians, and eventually we'll have people from Venezuela, from Haiti, from Cuba, and from Nicaragua. But lately, the last month, the flow is down 40% according to detentions. So give us a sense, what are the most important efforts by the Biden administration to try to cope with this crisis, Teresa?
Thank you so much, Rafael, and thank you to UC San Diego and COMEXI for inviting me today. I think it's important to understand that the Biden administration, for the most part, has relied on Title 42, the public health order that was instituted by the Trump administration in March 2020 to manage migration at the U.S.-Mexico border. Well, the Biden administration did end some programs that Trump started, such as the migrant protection protocols or the Remain in Mexico policy that sent migrants to wait in Mexico while their immigration court hearings proceeded in the United States. He left in place Title 42. And that has been used with the majority of encounters at the border to expel people from the United States. Particularly since Mexico agreed during the Trump administration to take back nationals of the Northern Triangle of Central America countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, as long as those nationalities represented the majority of non-Mexican arrivals, Title 42 was pretty good, if you will, or useful to the Biden administration so that they didn't have to release many people into the United States. That having been said, as you mentioned, we've seen very significant changes in who is arriving to the United States. And in April of last year, of 2022, the Biden administration finally, after I think a lot of pushing, decided that it wanted to end the Title 42 order's use at the border to expel migrants. That precipitated a series of court cases where some states challenged that decision in federal court in Louisiana. They got a stay, so the Biden administration was forced to continue to keep Title 42 in place. In November of last year, a judge in Washington, D.C., in a separate ruling decided that the use of Title 42 to expel migrants was no longer authorized and possibly not legal. That precipitated an appeal to the Supreme Court, which stayed that decision. So by court orders, the Biden administration has been forced, if you will, to keep Title 42 in place since April of last year when it first decided to take it down. That having been said, they just announced in the last month that they intend to end the COVID public health emergency under which that Title 42 order was created, and that would in fact end that order by May 11th of this year. So in January, the administration announced several measures that it is immediately taking and some that it would take to manage migration after the Title 42 order ends. Most importantly, the administration decided that it was going to issue a new regulation that would say that if you arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border, having transited other countries, and ask for asylum, you could be denied eligibility for asylum unless you show that you have applied for asylum in one of those other countries and been denied. Now, this has been called similar to a regulation that the Trump administration put in place, a so-called transit ban that was eventually struck down by the courts. The Biden administration insists that this is different because they are creating exceptions. So it is a presumption that you would not be eligible, but you are able to rebut that presumption and claim eligibility if there are significant issues of safety or medical conditions, if you show that you were not able to apply for some reason in the countries that you transited, and a few other things. But I think that a lot of people see this as sort of a more restrictive means of the administration trying to manage migration at the border after Title 42 comes down by limiting who is eligible to apply for asylum. That having been said, the administration is also opening new avenues to apply for parole or an exception to ask for asylum at the border. So in October of last year, given the significant increase in the number of Venezuelans coming to the border who could not be expelled under Title 42, the administration created a new humanitarian parole program. This was based on the parole program they instituted for the Ukrainians, so-called Uniting for Ukraine, and said that Venezuelans could apply for parole if they were not at the border, if they were applying from some other country other than Mexico, if they had a passport, if they had a sponsor in the United States willing to sponsor them, and then they would be granted permission to fly to the United States and given a 2-year parole with the ability to obtain work authorization upon arrival. However, people who showed up to the border not having gone through this process could be returned to Mexico under Title 42. That program was expanded to other nationalities, including Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians. At least Cubans and Nicaraguans were also populations that we were not able to expel either to Mexico or to their home countries under Title 42. And so those programs were expanded to those other nationalities. In addition, the administration indicated that it would begin using its immigration authorities to expand the use of expedited removal at the border. This is the traditional means by which most people encountered between the ports of entry had been processed before Title 42 and before the current crisis, if you will, of non-Mexican nationals coming across the border. What this means is that people who come without permission between ports of entry or without documents at ports of entry would be subject to a formal removal proceeding under Title 48 or under Title 8 immigration law without going to an immigration court. However, if they asked for asylum, if they said they were afraid of being returned home, they would have to be screened by an asylum officer to determine if they were eligible to apply for asylum in the United States. So DHS is working to expand telephonic availability of asylum officers for those kinds of screenings. It is trying to expand its ability to remove people under expedited removal. We have heard also rumors recently that the administration is reconsidering whether or not to detain immigrant families that arrive that cannot be expelled immediately under those under immigration authorities or under Title 42 until it's gone. And lastly, we have also heard the administration is considering restarting some expedited asylum processes that were started under the Biden administration, the so-called PACER and HARP programs. All of these things taken together express to me that the Biden administration is trying to lean heavily on enforcement and deterrent policies to address migration at the border. Even though it is expanding some of these parole opportunities, the fact that it is trying to limit the number of people who would be eligible to apply for asylum is concerning. I would also mention that they have agreed to significantly expand refugee processing in Latin America. This is the traditional means by which persons outside the United States can apply for protection. If approved, they are brought by the U.S. government to the United States to be resettled in the United States. Traditionally, U.S. refugee resettlement in Latin America has been a relatively tiny portion of our worldwide refugee program, but they have agreed to triple that number in the coming year. Taken together, we'll see if any of these programs, one, survive judicial scrutiny, because almost certainly they will be litigated. And some of them are already in court, including the parole programs that I just mentioned, but also whether or not they'll have a significant impact on the number of arrivals to the border.
Thank you, Teresa. You gave us a very complete picture of what's the Biden administration tried to accomplish in the border. Let me go to you, Ariel, and I wonder if you could share with us. You've been touring the border. You're with the MPI. You created a lot of data, and so I wonder if you could give us a sense of the recent dynamics in the U.S.-Mexico border, Ariel. And welcome to this webinar.
Thank you very much, Rafael, and thank you everybody for joining the webinar. I think we're going to go into some really good detail. Could we please, I have just a few set of slides here to show for those of you here. I'll try to not spend too long on these. As Rafael mentioned, I'm at the Policy Analyst at Migration Policy Institute, and we recently are doing some borders. We're conducting some border studies on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, and some of those insights will be in this webinar as well. Next, please. So before we get into the numbers that I think both Teresa and Rafael have mentioned, one of the key things is to try to understand that these numbers are coming into a perspective and sort of framework, context that has been developing now for several months, if not years. Right now we have the Los Angeles, last year we had the Los Angeles Declaration of Migration and Protection, where Mexico and the US made some commitments to address migration together, but also the other countries in the region. We've seen recently the North American Leadership Summit happen just earlier this year in Mexico City, and last year in the United States, including Canada as well. At the same time, we have seen political instability continue in Nicaragua, Haiti, and Venezuela, and I'll talk more about why that's important. And we've also seen changes in policies for Venezuelan migrants across the region, including in Colombia, but also in Costa Rica and other places. And we're still working with COVID as well. Next, please. So we've talked about the numbers now for a few times, but let's sort of narrow down what this means and entail. The graph that you have in front of you shows you in terms of bar charts what has been the encounters, total encounters between and at ports of entry at the U.S.-Mexico border. And what really comes out from this graph really quickly is that there's been a significant spike in encounters in fiscal year 2022. As you maybe know by now, there was almost 2.4 million encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border in fiscal year 2022, which has become a historic number, a record-breaking level. I should note that these encounters do not mean unique migrants, but in terms of how many times in total Border Patrol encounter different migrants together. So there is some duplication, but still it is a record-breaking year. In fiscal year 2023 so far, so including through January, we've already seen about 874,000 encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border. And likely by the time that February numbers come up later this month, we'll see that they have reached 1 million already. Now, the second component of this that's important to look at is the difference in compositions, not just the number of people coming across. You see that light teal bar in 2022 suggests that, in fact, a significant majority of the encounters in fiscal year 22 were actually from migrants from outside of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, which had been the trend previous to 2021. We've seen this increase and continue. We've seen some Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Cubans, and Haitians as well continue, but that's a significant key takeaway from this. And the fact that it continues, and even in larger shares in 2023, I think speaks to the real necessities that Teresa was highlighting earlier on. So next, please. Perhaps another side of the story that sometimes gets lost when we think about the numbers, we've talked about record-breaking levels of migration encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border, but Mexico actually, inside of Mexico, also has received significant number of apprehensions of migrants across the country. Just in 2022, almost 450,000 migrants were apprehended by Mexican authorities, also a record-breaking level for the Mexican government. Next, please. Next, please. Oh, there we go. Apologies for this. The next thing that we should note in terms of...
Ariel, there's a lot of noise there. Why don't we go... You tell us when those... there's a little more silent, so...
Can you hear me better now? Sorry, there was an ambulance coming by. I'm sorry. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Okay, yes. Go ahead.
Sorry, so I'll pick up right here. The point was that in the US-Mexico border, not just the top countries have been changing, but also the composition. And what this table suggests here that you have in front of you, that the numbers highlighted in red suggest is that after Mexicans and Northern Central Americans, the next highest nationality at the US-Mexico border, for example, in 2019, was Brazilians. In 2020, it was Cubans. In 2021, it was Ecuadorians. And in 2022 was Cubans, as well as now in 2023. This composition really speaks not only just to the flows, but also the policy dynamics that we have been discussing earlier on. And I think it's important for us to think about the conditions and spillover effects that this has for Mexican authorities as well. Next, please. If we go far enough to go, for example, at Panama, numbers of Panama migration authorities, we can see that these are not sudden changes in migration, but in fact shows that when changes happen in Panama, they then happen in Mexico, and then they change into the United States. It's not always a one-to-one ratio, but there are certain patterns. And what you see here very clearly in this graph shows you that in 2022 calendar year, Panamanian authorities apprehended a significant amount of Venezuelans. And then those Venezuelans were the ones that were then going to Mexico and ending their journey at the US-Mexico border. This is a regional issue, and again, it's not just at the US-Mexico border. Next, please. Another point that oftentimes goes unhighlighted in conversations is the toll that this sort of transit migration has actually took on Mexican asylum and the asylum system in Mexico. What you see in front of you is a graph of the number of asylum requests in Mexico that have come through these last several years. And you see that in 2021, Mexico broke a record, reaching about 131,000 migrants seeking asylum in Mexico. In 2022, the number was a little bit below 120,000, but still significantly higher than previous years. And that has a significant component that makes it a really difference for the capacity of this migrant or refugee association and committee to try to resolve these cases, and makes, again, an important aspect for the capacity of the Mexican government. What I think we can talk later on, if there are questions, is trying to understand who the migrants are asking for asylum. What does it mean for Mexicans that do receive asylum in Mexico, and what happens to them if they try to come to the Mexico? Next slide, please. I'll conclude by looking at the total number, sort of the total emphasis on what Mexico is also doing in enforcement. I think there is a really greatly summarized what the United States was doing. Since the last few years, and since 2019, Mexico has actually established permanent presence of the National Guard along its northern border with the United States, and sometimes also in the southern border. They had this declaration in 2019, the U.S. Mexico declaration, that actually led this happening at the same time that NPP was announced. In 2022, when we've seen Mexico, and now we've seen Mexico also add significant enforcement procedures, including by instituting visa requirements on citizens from Ecuador, Brazil, Venezuela, and a pre-registration component for Venezuelans. These types of restrictions tend to come at a time when migration in the U.S.-Mexico border has also improved and increased. I won't go into Title 42 because that's something that we talked about already. We can take some questions if you like, but I think it's important for us to also go back to the second U.S.-Mexico declaration and the first one that happened under President Biden, that really looked at how Mexican government could actually increase its capacity to not just detain migrants, but to also provide legal pathway status for them, which I think is sort of the other outlying component of this type of measures. Next slide, please. Other way. Sorry. Yeah, one more. There you go. So just to finish up here, Guatemala and other Central American countries have also done their own heightened enforcement. We can talk more about those questions. But for example, Guatemala is now also leveraging its national police at the its border with Mexico. El Salvador has already a similar border enforcement units, sort of what Border Patrol will be in the United States. And Panama and Costa Rica have increased surveillance. So I'll leave it there for now, Rafael, and plenty for us to talk about in questions.
Thank you very much, Ariel. That's a very good summary of the dynamics in the border. That's amazing. That's a lot of people already asking us if we could share that presentation. It will be in our web page as well as the web page of COMEXI. Albert, give us a sense of what are the political constraints for Mexico to help the U.S. and where you see, I mean, the conversation between Mexico and the U.S. It's López Obrador really willing to help Biden to stop this flow of migrants? I mean, tell us. I mean, what are the politics around this?
So I think we're caught in a bind. The first thing that I would say is that the problem seems to be that we're in a perpetual sense of crisis. But I would say crisis, what crisis? The crisis is every year. Every year it's a crisis, every year it's a crisis, every year it's a crisis. It's really time, I think, to probably think of some other way of looking at it, looking at the issue. But I think also the problem is the nature of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, but also the evolving nature of politics in both the United States and Mexico. The first thing I would say is if we look at demographics, if we look at economic indicators, if we look at the levels of violence, immigration from the region is going to continue to grow. It's going to go up, it's going to go down, but it's going to be a significant number of people. The other thing that we're seeing is obviously there's instability in other parts of the world, but more than anything else, there is a lack of mechanisms for regular migration. And so before, what we used to think of as economic migrants, I think now, especially with a feminization of migration with more children, we're seeing a change into searching for asylum as the only reasonable way of assuring that there is immigration. We come up with a problem. The bilateral relationship between the United States focuses essentially on three things, sometimes two of them at once, but most of the time, one at a time, which is immigration, drugs, trade. And so right now we're at the moment where we're looking at immigration, but all of a sudden, due to what Cecilia is going to be speaking about later, drugs are coming back up. The second thing that we have is the evolution of the political system in both the United States and Mexico. More in the United States has been a longer process, I think, of partisanship. And one of the things that we see is, first of all, the United States has depended on Mexico for a long time to try and stem some of this immigration. Even in 2014, the Obama administration was giving Mexico assistance and training, money. Part of the Merida initiative money went into that to try and stop the number of migrants coming to the United States. Mike Pompeo, in his recent book, Never Give an Inch, talks about a meeting with Ebrard right before the President López Obrador comes into office, in which he says, we're going to institute MPP and you're going to accept it. Ebrard says, Ebrard denies it. But in the book, he says that Ebrard said basically that it would be very, very difficult politically. And Pompeo said, even though Trump wanted to make this a big issue, a big win, they agreed that they were going to keep it quietly and just institute it. We move forward into 2019, June 2019, when President Trump threatened to impose tariffs on Mexico if something was not done with immigration. The response was to put the nascent National Guard into immigration activities, an activity that has expanded and continued since then. President López Obrador at first said that there had not been a deal, and then Trump, of course, took out a paper and showed signatures, and that was that. I think the whole point of this is that the United States has tried to collaborate with Mexico, sometimes the good way, and sometimes with a carrot, and sometimes with a stick. Right now, it seems to be trying a carrot. This is made more difficult because of what has happened in the United States. The reality is, it used to be that both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party had pro-immigration, anti-immigration wings. This has really shifted in the last 10 years to where the Republican Party has turned almost completely anti-immigration, and the Democratic Party has turned more completely pro-migration. One of the ironies of the Trump time was that more Americans became pro-immigrant. Nevertheless, Biden has found it extremely difficult to make any changes. And of course, now that the Republicans have Congress in their hands, one of the things that they're trying to do is to talk about how the border is out of control. The reaction to what happened last week with the 2 Americans that died and the 2 Americans that were injured obviously resulted in Dan Crenshaw and Lindsey Graham calling for American military intervention, something which President López Obrador very strongly pushed against yesterday, in fact, threatening that Mexican Americans and Latinos would vote against Republicans. So that's the state of play. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan. Ceci, thank you for accepting our invitation. What is your analysis of how this Tamaulipas episode will affect the border, will affect U.S.-Mexico cooperation on security issues, and will affect the flows of immigrants? Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join this panel today. Well, I think as you mentioned, as Albert mentioned, I think what happened in Tamaulipas connects to these longer narrative that we've been hearing now for a long time, and since the beginning of the Biden administration from the opposition, that cast the border as an area that is not properly administrated, and in fact that it's, where President Biden just lets the border be this area of chaos. So I think it ties into that narrative that has been pushed by the opposition, certainly where, the U.S.-Mexico border is just this perpetual zone in crisis, as Albert pointed out. I think for those in the U.S. side who definitely want to talk about cartels and narcos, the events in Tamaulipas connect to that very well, and it helps them to portray Mexico as this area where there is no control, where the state has no handle in what's going on. I think paradoxically, for the Mexican side, it actually shows the opposite. It shows that if you are an American citizen, there's going to be a swift response in terms of finding those who are allegedly guilty of this violence. So I think the response that we have seen from the U.S. and Mexican cities is actually it's very telling in terms of how these perceptions are at play. I think, unfortunately, because there has been a lot of frustration with the López Obrador administration in terms of a perceived inaction in terms of law enforcement, I think this forces the Biden administration to take a harder stance in terms of U.S.-Mexico cooperation. And so I think right now, going forward, the next few days, the next few weeks, the government of Mexico has a big task in front of them in terms of trying to calm, these waters that right now are very choppy, and send assuring messages that we are not the problem south of the border, but rather that we are a partner and that we care about the problems that affect our neighbor and again the partner that we want to be. I will say the Cienfuegos crisis also happened during this administration. We thought that was probably the low point of U.S.-Mexico security cooperation, and my concern is that it seems that what happened in Tamaulipas, and again that the straw that broke the camel's back, probably setting us up for a very complicated time in terms of security cooperation, if any, between the U.S. and Mexico.
Thank you, Cecilia. Sergio, I'll go to you, but I have a question from El Universal. They asking, how the Republican criticisms of Mexico and Mexican security will affect the cooperation on immigration. And but back to you, Sergio. Any comments, any questions? We have a lot of questions there.
Yeah, there's one question from Karina de Leon that says, what are your views on the procedures for requesting asylum in Mexico in order for migrants to move across Mexico and reach the northern border? Is there any dialogue on easing those procedures to avoid overwhelming cities as Tapachula in the south in extremely precarious conditions? And I may just add, Ariel, you just showed the number of asylum requests or how many were granted. Would be interesting just to learn how many asylums were granted. So I think this is more a question to you, perhaps, Ariel.
Sure, I'll take the first stab and then I'll come back with much as I can. One of the key things, I do have the number of how many asylum requests have been granted, but I don't have it right in front of me. I can, if you give me just a second, I can come back and find it for you and share it on the chat if you need to. But it is a fraction of the number of requests. The majority of people who apply for asylum in Mexico, especially in Tapachula, take often months, if not a year, to get processed. And sometimes people become frustrated with that process and decide to abandon it and go forward to the United States. So I do think this issue is tied to increasing the capacities of COMART and try to provide better assistance for them. To your earlier point or the earlier question about what happens when people, or what could be better in the improvement relationship with Mexico and the United States, so that people, asylum seekers in Mexico, can get more easily to the U.S. Mexico border when they qualify. I think there is some efforts between the U.S. and Mexican government to try to align, they're called essentially transfer agreements, protection transfer agreements between for the most vulnerable cases, where some migrants who are identified as being particularly vulnerable in Tapachula, for example, are then slowly walked through the process and get to the U.S. Mexico border in San Diego and potentially in Ciudad Juarez, or San Diego, Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, and El Paso, and those are some cases. There's also been some collaboration with children, but it continues to be numbers in the hundreds, perhaps not in the thousands. And the lack of capacity to reach the demand that exists for this type of protection, I think, is the bigger barrier. If there was one thing that I think the U.S. government can do is help provide more assistance to COMAR and to other agencies, so that Mexico actually has better resources, not just to receive migrants, but to actually adjudicate those claims through IOM and all through UNHCR. That will be my two quick responses, and I'll look for the approvals here in a minute.
Thank you, Ariel. Teresa, I think you want to say something, and then I'll.
Yeah, just very quickly, I just want to point out that the new proposed asylum regulation in the United States that would require migrants to have applied and been denied in another country before applying at the U.S.-Mexico border would actually increase the pressures, not just on the Mexican asylum system, but on the asylum systems of other countries in the region that are already overburdened. I mean, we talk about Costa Rica and the number of Venezuelans and Nicaraguans in Costa Rica. So I think it's incumbent upon the United States, if we're going to unilaterally say that people have to do this or not be qualified to come to the United States, to help these other countries significantly improve and increase their capacities to process asylum seekers. We talk about, that's part of the LA Declaration, we talk about burden sharing, but really we continue to kind of do these things that put more pressures on the partners we need to help us in migration. And some of that is due to the domestic politics that Alert mentioned. But I think we need to recognize that our domestic politics is maybe hurting our ability to get international cooperation where we need it.
And just to jump on that, I do think it's a quick point. Sorry, it's a bit interrupt. I do think it's an important point that Mexico is actually trying to, COMAR was trying to begin to expedite the way that it adjudicates asylum cases recently, but they walked that back because they thought that because more migrants may be denied, there would actually be more of an incentive for migrants to apply in Mexico, so they could be denied faster, and then therefore they can apply in the United States. So it's an important point to do that. In terms of approvals, the number I just found, it's 23,000 asylum requests were approved for protection or complementary protection in 2022, and about 1,500 have been approved so far in 2022. Thanks.
Thank you. Alright.
I just think it's important to point out to Ms. De Leon's question that, for example, holding people in Tapachula is part of the tactics to control the number of people that are going to be able to move forward. Because COMAR not only suffers, it's had 10-fold increase, it's actually had a 100-fold increase in requests for asylum over the past 10 years. it still has a $1.2 million budget. This is to Teresa's point. But the other thing is the way that the regulations are written is that you have to stay in the federative entity. You have to stay in the state or the city in which you first applied, which means that if you come through the border, get to Tapachula, apply in Tapachula, you're supposed to stay there for a year and a half, while there are more and more migrants coming in. There are no jobs. And so the pressure to move is tremendous. Once you move, then you are considered to have abandoned vacation. So we tried to change that, but it's been very difficult, and I can only see it as a measure of further control. The other thing to point out is that as the National Guard has taken more and more control of immigration enforcement, we have seen a significant increase of detentions in airports. Detentions holding people for up to 5 days, sending them back, conditions that are not good to encourage people to go back. So this is something I think that we need to see as part of the overall picture. There are large numbers of activities that are put in place to deter people from continuing or from staying where they are.
Thank you, Aller. There is another question also posed by Karina de Leon, and she says, do you have information on new routes for migrants through Central America? The Colombian authorities have announced a new route from San Andres Island to Nicaragua. And have you noticed any change on trends from Nicaragua? It seems that the new aerial route to Nicaragua for Angolans and people from the Middle East and India is opening through this country and then heading to the north. Is there any possible dialogue with the Nicaraguan migration authorities in regional platforms?
Sergio, I wonder if I could, there's another question for Eileen Teagan asking us for, what about the bicentennial framework, this new framework for security cooperation? I wonder if Cecilia, you could help us with that. And something else, Sergio, before we give the...
We can go to these two questions and then continue with the rest.
Ceci, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I think the bicentennial framework, I mean, that was a clear, the Lopez Obrador administration wanted to get rid, symbolically for sure, of the Murder Initiative. The bicentennial framework shows the willingness also of the U.S. government to work with that, and the need to have a framework in place, the interest of having a framework in place. I think the challenge that we have currently with the bicentennial framework is that while a fentanyl task force, for example, has been announced by the U.S. and the Mexican government, we don't know the details about the task force. We don't know exactly how is it that it is operating. And so I believe if there was ever a good time to provide details as to how this is working, it would be now for the Mexican government certainly to share this information as to how exactly is it that they're working on these issues. I mention this because now, for a number of years, the Mexican government has put on the agenda the importance of illicit firearms trafficking. And they have been trying to convince the American public that this is a shared problem between the US and Mexico. And so when Mexico unfortunately says that fentanyl is not our problem, that this is a US problem, then it's very hard to get empathy then for the cause of illicit firearms trafficking. So I think the bicentennial framework is important to have it. I do think, however, that right now the Mexican government, again, if there was ever a good time to give details as to what exactly they're doing, on the content of this would be a great time to also provide, especially I think the U.S. Congress, as to what are the actions that they are taking in this. And I think this, is very important for Mexico if we want to get the American public to care about illicit firearms trafficking from the U.S. to Mexico.
Ariel, I don't know if you have any comment related to the question on having people other from the Americas coming through the Americas, through Nicaragua, and then passing through north. And we still have 12 minutes left in the webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a full answer for it. I want to be transparent, but I can give you some ideas of what we've seen. In terms of the trends, Nicaragua has been a significant increased flow to the U.S., to Mexico, and to the United States. And it recently, has surpassed the levels of most of the Central American countries, other Central American countries. It's higher than El Salvador, for example, and it's almost as high as Guatemala. The other countries that have been talked about less as well is the number of Cubans and Peruvians coming through the Darien Gap, as well as coming through Mexico and the United States. And I think those have sort of shown some changes. They are so far not subject to Title 42 directly, or at least not to be returned to Mexico directly, but they are potentially an option if there was any more expansions of those expulsions. In terms of the routes, we have seen that there's been a change, or maybe not a change, but an additional maritime routes in the Gulf of Mexico and also in the Pacific. Even in San Diego, you've seen some of those increasing there. But it's hard to tell exactly if they are mostly Nicaraguans or from other countries. Whether the question about whether there's anything that the United States or Mexico can do to try to get Nicaragua to pay more attention to these, I think it's a really good one. But frankly, I don't know that there's yet a established protocol or back channel for the government to talk about this directly. I think working with Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua has proved difficult for the United States. And though Mexico has a little more leverage in talking to Cuba and Venezuela, I don't think that's the same for Nicaragua. So that's what I know.
Thank you very much, Ariel. Teresa, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, Ariel did point out that the United States, one of the things the United States prevailed upon Mexico to do was to impose new visa requirements for certain nationalities that we were seeing coming into the border. And I think that we have to recognize that visa policies that other countries have, particularly with regard to extracontinental migrants, does impact what we see the movements through the hemisphere. How did 8,000 Ukrainians end up at the San Diego border within weeks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Because Ukrainians could get to Mexico very simply. And so it is worth understanding, and as Ariel rightly pointed out, we may not have in the United States a very good way of asking Nicaragua very politely, could you think about imposing visa requirements? Mexico might be able to, but knowing which countries have visa-free travel and understanding that is, I think, very key to understanding where the migration flows might shift in response to various changes that countries impose. And I think that goes back to what I think Allard said. We are a decade into what might be considered a migration crisis, right? And what we're finding is this is not a U.S.-Mexico crisis. This is not even a hemispheric crisis. This is a worldwide crisis. And now the world knows if you want to get to the United States, you come to the U.S.-Mexico border. And that has impacts for every country in the hemisphere. And it means also that we can't deal with it only at the U.S.-Mexico border.
Thank you, Allard, please. And let me pose you one question, Allard, before you take this. What is the balance of Biden's border security policy looking forward to the next presidential election? Do you think it's going to affect the Democratic Party?
Wow. A very quick question, just to answer very quick comment to answer the previous question. I think our experience with Ecuador in the last decade, Ecuador all of a sudden opened up to immigration from all over the world without visas. And what we saw was not people going to Ecuador to stay in Ecuador, but rather to move through and on. What Ariel was talking about with the Darien Gap, it's very, very difficult terrain. My sense is Nicaragua is opening up, not to bring in more people into Nicaragua, but to bring in some funds. And where they go afterwards, we don't care. And in fact, it might even help us in our sort of international policy. I think what Biden is trying to do is he's trying to walk a very fine line between what most Democrats would see as a proper immigration dialogue, one that helps human rights, one that plays proper attention to refugees and to asylum, and the charges that the border is out of control. The Democrats had started to have a campaign rebutting some of these charges by saying, well, if we're actually stopping all this fentanyl, then it must mean it's not out of control. If we weren't finding any fentanyl and people were dying of fentanyl, then it would be out of control. But we're We're making record busts. We're making record detentions. And so I don't know. I think he's going to try and keep walking the tightrope. I think it's a very, very difficult issue because it's very emotional, and it really does play to where the Republican Party wants to go with white nationalism, Christian nationalism.
Well, we need to start closing our webinar, and let me ask you the same question to the three of you. That is, we have the political campaigns already on, and then, well, four of you, of course, Cecilia. And then what would be the effect of political campaigns and the rhetoric that we will expect in political campaigns versus the cooperation between Mexico and the U.S., or the lack of, as Cecilia mentioned, if there is some cooperation. So what would be your stake in terms of the impact on the cooperation of political campaigns?
Who wants to start? Ceci, you can help us, Cecilia, come
on. So, I mean, as Eller was mentioning, I think these, you know, the problem is that these plays into exactly what we don't want to play. I think for Mexico, we know exactly how it is when we're on the wrong side of the relationship, meaning when Mexico is characterized as a problem south of the border. And so we have that experience and how difficult that is, and how we were essentially always one tweet away from the next crisis. And so I don't think we want to go back to that. I think we should take that experience, that very recent experience, and the government of Mexico, again, should really work. And, you know, this is a good time to go to Washington, D.C. and try to calm those waters. Whether or not this administration that has shown not a lot of interest in that international experience will do it, that's another question. But I think we do know how it is when we're on the wrong side. And I don't think anyone wants to repeat that, because it really affects many other areas of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, including trade, which, you know, generally is the star in the relationship, but, you know, it could also potentially have effects on that. And so I think for the sake of the complexity and everything that this entails, this is a good time to, you know, to remember how it was during those 4 years and to take action on that.
Thank you. Aller, you raise your hand.
No, but anyway, just to answer the question, I think we need to be, I think we need to see what's happening on both sides of the border. On the American side, I think we've talked about what the Republicans are trying to do politically with what is happening on the border, the tightrope that Biden has to play, which could cost him support among certain parts of the population. But the other part, and one we haven't really spoken about very much, is what happens with nationalism in Mexico. What happens with a president who is seen some of what he's wanted to do on energy slightly stymied by TEMEC, by USMCA, and what happens then if nationalism grows? They're threatening us again militarily. President López Obrador is fighting several fights at once, but against a divided political opposition. And so using the nationalist card would not surprise me as one of the tools to be used. We could have started with energy, but now we have the question about military intervention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a dicey time.
I think my perspective is similar to what others have said. It is a kind of precarious time. I mean, we are looking at, I think, if I recall, tell me if I'm wrong, presidential elections in both countries in 2024. So the domestic politics in each country are heavily impacted by this bilateral issue, and in very, I think, different ways. And I think you're starting to see President Biden, who has actually not formally declared he's running for re-election, but everyone expects he will. His rhetoric, the things that he has put forward, including in this budget that he just released this week, seem to want to lean heavily on, you can trust me, I will enforce the border. He is not repeating some of the campaign promises he made in 2020 about dealing with humanitarian situations and repealing the Trump policies. He's actually reinforcing some of those. So this campaign message is definitely going to be, you can trust me, I will enforce the border. I think that's the primary message. We already have former President Trump in the race for the Republican side. We know where he's going to be. And you have a Republican House of Representatives that is also up for re-election in 2 years that is banging the drum hard about we need to secure the border. So I do think that it's going to be a central issue for our campaigns and over the next 2 years. You know, I can't speak to the Mexican election. I'm not as familiar with Mexican politics, but I would hope that we could theoretically be in for an inflection point like we had in 2000 with the election of Vicente Fox and George W. Bush, who, because of their relationship as two new presidents in the country from the border regions, reset the U.S.-Mexico relationship, I think, on a much better footing that lasted for a good decade and a half. And then it's deteriorated since. So, you know, if I could be a little bit optimistic, I would hope that maybe there's a chance that that could happen depending on what happens in the elections. But I think we have to acknowledge that at least rhetorically and because of the political realities in both countries, the border will remain a challenging issue.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Ariel, do you have a final comment?
I think what's lost in the politics of this is the border town communities on both sides. I think whatever the politics are at the federal level in the US or in Mexico, what's going to be clear, regardless of what happens in May, is that there's going to be significant need for assistance on the US and Mexican side. And I think everybody should be focusing about that as well. From Tijuana to Ciudad Juarez to Reynosa and all the other cities on the US side as well.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. We have reached the end of our webinar. And I think that we touched upon a very critical set of topics, not only immigration, but security, which it becomes very relevant and is very well intertwined with immigration. And we will see this coming along in the campaigns, particularly in the US campaign, that at least we have started listening to this. So we will have another webinar of this with another topic on April 14th, and we want to invite you to participate with us. And thank you very much to our panelists. It was a great discussion, very interesting, particularly learning the details of what is really happening on the ground. And Rafael, getting back to you.
Thank you, Sergio, and thank you to COMEXI and El Universal and all of these Mexican newspapers. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Aldo. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Ariel. You were wonderful. I'm sorry, Sergio, but I'm pessimistic. I would say difficult times are coming. Not only did the episode in Tamaulipas precipitated a crisis, but politics are around the corner. We'll have campaigns, and yes, you're right, Ariel. There's going to be trouble in the border. Thank you all, and see you in the second Friday of April. Adiós. Muchas gracias.